Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our October public webinar for Yachad BeYeshua. For those of you whose first time it is, Yachad BeYeshua is an international, interdenominational fellowship of Jewish disciples of Jesus. My name is Jason Moraff, and I'm one of your hosts. It is wonderful to be back with you all after a brief hiatus. A lot has changed since I last hosted a webinar. My wife and I welcomed our daughter, our first child, Nora, into the world. And shortly thereafter, I completed my doctorate at Fuller Seminary, just a couple weeks after she was born. And then about 3 months ago, we packed up, left Pasadena, and then moved to Texas so I could join the faculty here at the King's University here in Southlake. So a lot has changed for me, but a lot has also changed for my co-host, Amanda Achman. So I will pass it over her to share with us the new things that have happened with her.
Thank you, Jason. And I echo everyone's congratulations to you. Beautiful to hear all of these good updates. As for me, I'm now living in Rome and studying in the new licentiate program of the Pontifical Gregorian University in Judaic Studies and Jewish Christian Relations. And so it's a joy to be in Rome. I've been here about a month and a half, and this is a 2-year program that I'm embarking on. So now I'm very excited to kick off this session. Today we have Professor Judith Wolfe, who's going to be speaking with us about the life and witness of Edith Stein, who was a German Jewish philosopher who was baptized in the Catholic Church in 1922. She was born in 1891. And she entered the Carmelite order, and she died at Auschwitz in 1942. In her honor, we're going to begin with a prayer of hers. Here we go. Oh my God, fill my soul with holy joy, courage, and strength to serve you. Enkindle your love in me, and then walk with me along the next stretch of road before me. I do not see very far ahead, but when I have arrived where the horizon now closes down, a new prospect will open before me, and I shall meet it with peace. So today we're going to begin with an interview with Professor Wolfe and then have a journey story from Jason. So we get to hear both about your recent updates and a bit more of your story in depth. Looking forward to that. Then, as always, we'll have some time for Q&A. So throughout the interview and throughout the story, feel free to drop your questions into the chat and we'll consolidate them and ask them on your behalf. At the end of the webinar, Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinzer will provide some brief updates and announcements. So now I turn it over to Jason to introduce our presenter for today.
Thank you, Amanda. At this time, I'd like to invite Professor Judith Wolfe to turn on her camera and microphone as I introduce her. So Judith Wolfe is Professor of Philosophical Theology at the University of St. Andrews, where she serves as the director of the graduate program in Theology and the Arts. She was born to an Austrian Catholic mother and an Israeli secular Jewish father, and was raised within the ecumenical movement. Among several other degrees, Professor Wolfe holds a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford and continues to work on Jewish-Christian relations on behalf of the Catholic Church. She is also one of our assistant moderators of the International Coordinating Committee of Yachad BeYeshua. So please join me in welcoming Professor Wolfe.
Thank you.
Wonderful to have you with us. So tell us, why are we talking today about Edith Stein?
Edith Stein is one of the exemplary Jewish Christians of the 20th century, perhaps of the whole modern era. She was born and died at times that were pivotal for the self-understanding that Jewish disciples of Christ have now. And her life was exemplary. Her intellectual achievements were outstanding. To those of us who feel called to an intellectual life, she is a great exemplar. And her sacrifices, she saw it on behalf of the Jewish people, on behalf of her people in Christ, was no doubt part of what allowed the Messianic Jewish movement, the Hebrew Catholic movement, and so many others to flourish in the later part of the 20th century. She was recognized as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, is also celebrated in the Lutheran Church, and is now one of the few patrons of Europe. So she has a lot to teach us, I think, and it's well worth engaging with her. And I'm very glad that we're making a start together today.
Okay, thank you. So what was her relation to Judaism and to her heritage, and what's her story about how she came to faith?
Well, she was born on Yom Kippur, which was actually that year, the 12th of October, so just yesterday. We just celebrated her birthday. In 1981, she was the family's 11th child. 4 had died young, and she ended up being the youngest because her father died when she was only less than 2 years old. Her mother, 4 of her older siblings had also died young, and her mother took over what was then an ailing wood selling business, turned it into a flourishing business, and put the family on a secure financial footing. So they were relatively well off. Her mother had grown up very religious, retained a devout Jewish faith until her death in 1936, and raised the children in the Jewish faith, in Jewish observance. Edith was a dreamy child, first given to many fears in her early years, and then to much daydreaming. She always thought she was born for greatness in one way or another, although she didn't know how. She was an excellent student, but I think with the years, she found it harder and harder simply to repeat what she had been taught, both in school and religiously. So at age 13, she decided to stop school. She went to live with her older sister in Hamburg for nearly a year. And there she also gave up her belief in God. She was 13 at the time, nearly 14, and called herself an atheist for about 7 or 8 years. Her chief values at the time, I think, were truth and goodness. And it really plagued her that she didn't know where to find an adequate grounding for goodness. She felt that it was very important, more important to be good than to be smart, but she didn't know how one could ground it. So she helped with her sister's household. She questioned. She went back to school at age 14 or 15, and was again an excellent student. Very independent, very responsible, had a great capacity for empathy, although she was also severely critical of her fellow students and people around her, which ended up being one of the things that made her question how one could achieve goodness without help by somebody outside of oneself. As I say, until age 20, she considered herself an atheist. She then began studying psychology and transferred from Breslau, where she was born and raised, to Göttingen after 2 years, where she met Edmund Husserl, who was the father of phenomenology. I can talk more about that later. But she discovered Edmund Husserl, she discovered phenomenology and his circle, and she was utterly bewitched by this new way of doing philosophy, which was psychologically influenced. And she found her home, her intellectual home, very much there. She ended up doing most of her work in phenomenology, although we'll see, I think later, that it was also influenced by Thomas. In any case, Husserl was a Protestant Jew. He had been baptized into the Protestant church. He did not, I think, have a particularly living faith of his own until his very last months, when the nun who cared for him wrote down his remarks, and she wrote down one of his remarks as being, God is good, yes, God is good, but extremely hard to understand. But many of his students were drawn to the Christian faith, and particularly importantly for Edith Stein, one of his former students, now assistant, called Adolf Reinach, who was himself of Jewish origin, and discovered Christ in the early years of the First World War. He was about 8 years older than Edith, and in him and his wife, Edith found for the first time somebody who had a kind of love and care that transcended circles of friendship or kinship, and seemed to her a sort of light from another realm. which she couldn't quite account for, but she was fascinated by it. And Reinach himself really only took the last steps to faith in 1916, just before he died in the trenches in 1917. But his death and the reaction of his wife to his death made a very powerful impression on Edith. She was asked to be his literary executor, but she dreaded meeting up with his wife because her own grief was so great that she didn't know how his wife might bear it. And her biographer has a beautiful description of their meeting, which I'll read. This is from Waltraud Herbstreet, and she writes, Edith Stein, the doubting and despairing one, was comforted by the Christian woman whom grief had not managed to shatter. This experience overwhelmed the unbeliever. She saw another dimension of a hidden world whose center was Christ. For the first time, the mystery of the crucified and risen Lord dawned on her. She began to read the Gospels and began to consider whether she should become Lutheran or Catholic. So this was in 1917-18. Her crisis lasted a few years longer. In 1921, so when she was 30, she spent a summer at the house of a friend of hers, also a phenomenologist, Hedwig Konrad Martius, also a very interesting thinker. And she was there alone an evening, and she grabbed a book from the shelf randomly, and it was the autobiography of Teresa of Avila. And she was captured by the story. She found in it the answers to her own search, and she read all night long. And in the morning, she said, this is the truth. And it wasn't an abstract truth. It was the sort of the truth that God loved her and that he demanded her own existential response of love in return. So the following year, she was baptized, and she took the name Teresa, and her godmother was Hedwig Konrad Martius.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. As you mentioned her relationship with Edmund Husserl, I was wondering if you would expand a bit about her intellectual work and how that interacted with her faith.
Sure. So Edith Stein came into philosophy at a fascinating time for philosophy, also a time of crisis, but one that bore a lot of promise. Philosophers at the time, so we're talking 1910s, were really disillusioned with the great philosophical systems of the 19th century, which Hegel and so forth, which sort of constructed this big overarching meta-narrative of the world. And seemed to have an explanation for how all of history was going, a sort of God's eye view of everything. And by the 1910s, particularly then, of course, when the First World War came, and Europe was in utter crisis, this was now seen to be, a castle in the clouds, a sort of false, overweening kind of self-delusion. And so philosophers tried to rebuild philosophy on more modest foundations. And Husserl was at the forefront of this, and he founded this movement method called phenomenology, where you always take into account, whenever you look at things, what your own relationship to that thing is, and you take into account that you can only see things from your own perspective, and you need to take that into account as you describe what it is you're seeing, without, of course, trying to, sort of refer everything back to yourself. It's a sort of gesture of humility. And she was captivated by that. Her doctoral dissertation was on the problem of empathy, which already signals to you both, of course, her own particular interest in empathy, which to her was a mystery that was worth exploring. It also signals the fact that phenomenology is particularly good at trying to tease out the intricacies of our relational being in the world. So it's particularly good at analyzing things that include relationships within them, like empathy, like other people. And so she wrote this dissertation. She tried after that, between 1916 and 1918, she was Husserl's assistant, and she tried after that to write what we would call a postdoctoral thesis, a habilitation, which would give her the license to teach at the university. She was not allowed to do that because she was a woman, and so she ended up being a school teacher for a long time, then a teacher at a pedagogical college. But she continued her work, and during the time that she was a teacher, she was asked to translate Thomas Aquinas's On Truth from Latin into English. And this was a completely different intellectual world. So on the one hand, we have mostly secular philosophers some Christians who were building this method of phenomenology. On the other hand, we had a Roman Catholic revival of trust in Thomas Aquinas, who is, of course, completely different in the sense that everything in the world is explained by reference to God. For Thomas, you can't make sense of anything, of love, of goodness, of our being, of the ends to which we're living and so forth, without an understanding that we are made by God and held in being by God. Whereas, of course, for somebody like Husserl, making such assertions would be ridiculously overweening, because how do we know from within our limited perspective what it might be possible to say about such a thing as the transcendent? Do we even know that there is transcendence? Can we ever tell from our own perspective? And so, in a sense, Edith Stein made her life's work the reconciliation of a phenomenological perspective with a Thomist ontology. So she tried to argue that even if we look at our own experience, we can't ever give a coherent picture, a coherent account, even of what we experience, how we experience ourselves, our lives, other people, without admitting that we are somehow existentially open to something that's beyond the purely immanent. And so her last great work, Finite and Eternal Being, which she finished writing as a Carmelite and which was published posthumously, tries to reconcile phenomenology and Thomist ontology, and is very exciting. Although unfortunately, she writes very dryly. Her ideas are always more exciting than her prose, but it's worth wading through.
Thank you for that. Could you comment a little bit, and this is a vast topic, but on her sense of Jewishness once she had entered the church, and specifically on whether you think her Jewish Catholic identity was constructive for her in making and attempting this synthesis of phenomenology and metaphysics?
That's a small little question. Well, for her family, her conversion was very, very difficult. Interestingly, her family was from Breslau, and in Breslau, the Roman Catholic faith was very much a peasant faith or a lower class faith. So her siblings and her mother tell in some reflections that for them, Catholicism was shuffling on the floor on your knees and kissing the priest's feet. And they just could not understand how their fiercely independent, smart daughter and sister could ever stoop to something like that. But she was very patient. She tried not to disrupt family life. She continued to go to synagogue with her mother. She continued to fast on Yom Kippur and so forth. And I think her mother, who was herself very devout, eventually just could not deny the light of grace in her daughter. And so when she entered the Carmelite order in 1933, that was really, really difficult for her mother. But they wrote to each other every week, which was not usually allowed to Carmelite nuns, but Edith Stein's abbess understood that it was important in this case. For Stein herself, interestingly, there was this almost matter of courseness about being Jewish as well as Catholic. That was not a problem for her, in the sense that she never seems to have questioned whether she could remain Jewish while also having a Catholic faith. For most of the time, her Jewishness for her was very much under the sign of Nazism. So she understood very early on that the fight against the Jews was a fight against the humanity of Christ, because Christ was a Jew, and therefore to fight against the Jews was in some sense to fight against the incarnation. And so she writes already in 1933 that she realized that the cross that was being laid on the Jewish people was the cross of Christ. That most people did not realize this, but that those who did had to bear it willingly on behalf of those who didn't. So she asked herself a lot how she could bear this cross on behalf of, or in the stead of her Jewish brothers and sisters. She considered going to Rome to ask the Pope for an encyclical on the question of the Jews in 1933 already. She decided not to do that in the end. She had been a teacher, as I say, at a Roman Catholic pedagogical college until 1933, when the Nazis began to withdraw professional licenses from all sorts of professions, and she had to stop teaching. And it was then that she finally fulfilled her long desire to enter a Carmelite monastery. The Carmelites, of course, partly because the Carmel is the only order that traces its origin back to Israel, to Mount Carmel. The Carmel also because the main vocation of Carmelites is to pray and stand in the presence of God on behalf of others. So they see themselves sort of as being able to be everywhere because they are hidden in nowhere. And she saw that as very much as a Jewish vocation, in a sense, this sort of vicariousness for the Jewish people and of the Jewish people, because the Jewish people, are, to her mind, vicarious for all the nations before God. So that is how she decided to bear this cross, by praying, by standing with her people, and doing that quietly while also continuing her work. I think she probably didn't see this Jewish-Christian tension as constitutive in any sense of her work on the tension between phenomenology and ontology, but clearly there's a sort of willingness to stand in the breach between traditions, a sort of fearlessness about not belonging to either camp, and a strong sense that there's a hidden God, and for the Jewish people there's a hidden God, but there's also a very incarnate presence of his people in the world, and so you have to hold those two together. So it may well be that actually it did have a lot to do with what she was working on.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. Last question to Jason.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I look forward to seeing the further reading list after this. So you already alluded to it, but tell us a bit about her last years and her death in her last few minutes.
Sure. Yeah, so as I've mentioned, she entered the Carmelite monastery in 1933. Beside her work of prayer there, she engaged in a wide correspondence. She gave counsel to visitors, and she prepared her great philosophical manuscript for publication. They were already starting to print it in 1938, but then of course had to stop, and it was eventually published posthumously in 1950. In 1938, it became clear to her that her presence at the Carmelite monastery in Cologne, where she was, threatened the safety of her sisters there, and so she was transferred to Echt in the Netherlands, which was neutral at the time, which was still free at the time. There she was asked to write a big study on St. John of the Cross, whose 400th anniversary it was, one of the great outstanding figures of the Carmelite order, which she managed to finish. In 1939, she wrote her last will, which let me just read a quick excerpt from that, because it's telling of her self-understanding as a Jew. She says, and I excerpt, "I beg the Lord to take my life and my death for his glory, in expiation of the unbelief of the Jewish people, and that the Lord will be received by his own people, and his kingdom shall come in glory for the salvation of Germany and the peace of the world," etc., etc. So, I'm something to think about, although I'm not going to say anything more about it, but this, again, this sort of sense of vicariousness or expiation. And then in 1940, the Nazis entered Holland. Her sister Rosa had now joined her from Breslau. She had also become a Christian, or become a Catholic, and worked as a porter at the monastery for 2 years. And then in 1942, it became clear that they were no longer safe there, that the sisters were no longer safe having them, and an attempt was made to transfer Edith and her sister to Switzerland, which, however, the permissions didn't come in time. So in August 1942, the Nazis, a Nazi officer came and arrested her and her sister and took them to Auschwitz. And we in all likelihood, they were gassed there on the 9th of August. 1942, along with a number of other Christian Jews, in retaliation for an encyclical letter, a pastoral letter by the bishops in Holland protesting the persecution of the Jews. So in retaliation, the Nazis killed a whole lot of people. And very memorably, as she was arrested, she took her sister by the hand and she said, "Come, let us go for our people."
Okay, thank you for that. And I see we've received a few questions. Continue to ask your questions. And after Jason shares his story, then we will be getting to those. So we look forward to your questions. Thank you for sharing with us. That was really a great overview of such an expansive and influential and relevant life. So thank you, Professor Wolfe. So now I'd like to invite Jason to speak with us. He was raised in an interfaith household and within the Messianic Jewish movement. He recently completed his doctorate in New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary, and this past fall, Jason began serving as assistant professor of biblical studies at the King's University in Texas, as he touched on at the beginning. So let's welcome Jason. Thank you for sharing this time.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's a tough act to follow. But basically what I thought I would do today is to give an overview of what set me on the path to where I am today, basically to share how I got here. How did I become a Messianic Jew and who does New Testament studies? And what are the kinds of things that I've wrestled with, continue to wrestle with as a child of the Messianic Jewish world? Unsurprisingly, as you'll probably hear, questions of identity and belonging are pretty paramount to my experience within the Messianic Jewish world. So to that end, I want to share some major pivot points in my life, some that launched my academic journey, and some spaces and experiences that were particularly formative on me and my direction. And so, as Amanda mentioned, I'm from an interfaith, multi-ethnic household. My mother is Puerto Rican. She was raised Catholic and is now would identify as non-denominational, though she attends a Messianic Jewish congregation. And my father is Jewish. He was raised in a conservative synagogue. His grandparents immigrated to the United States. So his family's been in the States for some time. And they kind of followed the standard Jewish trajectory in the States, where his father was raised Orthodox, he was raised conservative, and then our household was essentially Reform in practice. We did some Jewish things, but it wasn't permeating our lives. My dad, we didn't keep kosher. We observed holidays loosely. So in my home life, it was more of a blend of two traditions with some Messianic Jewish elements, but I think it's probably more accurate to describe my upbringing as interfaith. So from really my childhood, I kind of sat in this liminal space and was kind of unsure how to categorize myself, because I grew up in a predominantly African-American neighborhoods, and I looked white, but at the same time was Puerto Rican and was Jewish. I actually played a lot of Boys and Girls Club sports as a kid, and typically I was the only not Black kid on the team, not just even on the team, but in the entire program. And so that was an interesting experience to be in that community and to be welcomed in that community, but there were no pretenses that I wasn't different. But it didn't matter. At the same time, the people around me were my teammates, they were my friends. Even if we liked different music, came from different cultures, that the fact that I was different didn't matter. They welcomed me, they were my friends. And it's really been over the past few years that I've realized just how formative that experience was and that environment was for me. It's radically shaped how I think of difference, so particularly influenced how I think of ecclesiology and things of identity, questions of identity, and how I perceive the world. But again, it shows that I kind of grew up in this space where I always was a little different. So as I also mentioned, I was raised in the Messianic Jewish world, which raises the question of how did my parents, an interfaith couple, end up in the Messianic Jewish world? The story that my dad would tell is that shortly into my parents' marriage, around Christmas time, he got a little uncomfortable when my eldest sister started singing about baby Jesus around Christmas time. And so that caused some marital tensions, and they went to a marriage counselor, and it was actually the marriage counselor who pointed them to a local Messianic Jewish congregation in Maryland, where we lived at the time. And so they went, it was a happy medium. And so that's where we were raised. The congregation itself, we would recite the Shema, we would have a Torah service, sing Messianic Jewish songs, sing songs in Hebrew. So it had this Jewish element, but besides that, it was not particularly traditional in terms of Jewish practice. It was, and so again, I felt like I was in this weird hybrid space of Christianity and Judaism. But that obviously was a very impactful environment for me. It's where I made some of my closest friends. It's where I met my wife. Her father was an elder in that community. But there was this constant awareness, especially as I would go outside of that space, that I was at this kind of weird intersection of Judaism and Christianity. I wasn't quite sure how to describe my faith to people. I'm Jewish, but I also believe in Jesus, so am I a Christian? So it caused some interesting, cognitive dissonance, I guess, whenever friends would ask, like, what's your religion or what's your religious community? And it always raised questions to me of how do I explain myself to others? But nevertheless, I continued to attend that community. My family was still a part of that community. And when I was about 15, I went to a camp called Camp Kesher, sponsored by Chosen People Ministries. And there I had what I would probably call a fairly cliche evangelical camp experience where I started to take my faith in Jesus very seriously. And I don't call it cliche to denigrate it in any way, but merely to give an idea of the framework in which I was operating and the kind of the culture and the ethos around it. But so all this to say, in the middle of high school, I started to take following Jesus seriously. And at about that same time, the congregation we were part of hired a new rabbi who began talking more and more and emphasizing and encouraging the community to take seriously its Jewishness, to adopt more tradition. He brought in more liturgy. He encouraged more observance. So those things together really started to get me thinking more and more about what it meant, not just to follow Jesus, but to follow Jesus as a Jew. And so I continued to think about those things as I started college. And in my freshman year of college at the University of Maryland, I started attending InterVarsity Christian Fellowship simply because my sister was there. And so it was an easy in. I didn't have to kind of start from scratch in the community. But I joined a small group there, a men's Bible study there. And it was really in that environment that I realized just how my Jewishness impacted how I read the Bible and how I went about doing theology. I realized especially that I read the New Testament very differently. I heard more echoes of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament. I assumed different things about the law. I cared about things like Jew-Gentile dynamics. I just noticed things. I approached the text differently than them. But even beyond that, I realized that I really loved studying the Bible. I found that this was a lot of fun to me. And I really enjoyed discussing theology. It was much more interesting than the psychology I was studying at the time. And so about halfway through my freshman year, I decided I wanted to go study the Bible somewhere. At this point, I had no idea. I knew nothing about biblical studies or theological studies. I just knew I wanted to study the Bible. And I knew that, and I had a friend who had mentioned this place called Moody Bible Institute. And so I figured if I want to study the Bible, where else to do that? Where better to do that? So I actually applied to Moody almost on a whim, almost blindly, thinking that if I get in, I'll go. And that's what happened. I got in, so I went. But again, timing worked out really well. And providentially, you might say, that before I moved to Chicago to go to Moody, I had the opportunity to go on a service trip to Israel. And it was there that had further entrenched my Jewish identity and thinking about what it meant that I was Jewish and followed Jesus. So there, and after the trip, I started becoming more observant, but still became very aware of how largely ignorant I was about normative Judaism. But that was about to change as well, because I met a young woman on the trip who was part of Messianic congregation in the Chicago community, a Chicago area called Devar Emet. And she said, when you come to Chicago, come attend this, come visit us. And so my second or third week in Chicago, I went and I just fell in love. The community was close to a conservative synagogue. It was much more liturgically oriented. It was much more traditional, much more observant. And it really introduced me to the beauty of tradition and liturgy and started educating me in normative Judaism, giving me that knowledge I was looking for. And so honestly, there is where I fell in love with Judaism. And the rabbi there, Kirk Leapy, actually was very instrumental in me pursuing academia and pursuing teaching, because he saw a gift for teaching that I didn't know I had. And he was always pushing me and challenging me to teach. He started me with the youth and the children, and then pushed me, almost kicking and screaming, to teach the adults. And it was that doing that really ignited my love for teaching. So while I was in Chicago, I had this really interesting double life almost. On the one hand, I was at Moody, an evangelical Christian institution, and while also attending a more observant Messianic Jewish congregation. So on the one hand, I was surrounded by Christians who, to whom I basically had to justify my existence or my way of following Jesus. They didn't think much of a present role for Jews or value much the Torah or Jewish tradition. So I felt like I had to justify myself a lot. But on the other hand, I was hearing messages that were reinforcing the importance of living as a Jew when following as a Jesus follower. So this just reinforced my sense that I exist at this weird intersection of Judaism and Christianity, and feel like in a lot of ways I just swim upstream most places that I'm at. But I enjoyed it. I saw the value and the importance of these tough conversations and the need for Messianic Jewish voices in Christian spaces, the need for somebody to embody Jews and Judaism in Christian space. And being at Moody reinforced my love for studying the Bible. So it was there, and for those reasons, that I decided to pursue a PhD in New Testament. And it drove me to want to teach in a confessional environment. So to be this Jewish voice, so I could be this Jewish voice and be this representation of Jews and Judaism to Christians in Christian theology and in New Testament studies in particular. Those are the big formative events that set me on this path. My graduate education at Duke and Fuller was a lot of the same, where I felt kind of where I existed at this weird intersection with a foot in one world, a foot in the other, but also belonging to neither fully at the same time, and continuing to grapple with what it meant to be Jewish and follow Jesus. It also, being able to travel around the country, has also enabled me to see a variety of Messianic Jewish communities and see the diversities of practice and theology within that community, and consider what are some of the challenges facing the wider community. And so these are questions that I continue to grapple with, and both in my daily life, not just on the academic side. You know, unsurprisingly, my academic work is deeply personal to me, and is the result of my own working through questions of identity and belonging and theology in general. And so even as I continue to grapple with these things, I know that all of these experiences have driven me to pursue and embody truth at this weird intersection of Judaism and Christianity. And so I've always thought of myself and my work as a bridge between the various worlds that I've inhabited. And that's really what's brought me here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. And now I'll also invite Professor Wolfe to turn back her camera and microphone so that we can engage in the Q&A session. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. There's still time, so get your questions in if you'd like to ask something. First question about Edith Stein is, do you think that Stein's work on empathy has a specific intellectual connection with her ability to understand herself as both Jewish and Catholic? Does it add a distinct dimension to her Jewish identity?
That's a beautiful question. I'm not sure it's one that I can answer. I mean, I think she was herself a very empathic person. People always report that about her. Again, they also report that she was a fiercely critical person, and that one of the things that happened when she found faith was that she was able to turn her very sharp eye of criticism away from trying to oust others, or trying to triumph over others in any way, to trying to protect them, to protect their weakness. And her empathy of understanding others helped her to try to find their weaknesses and cover them, in a sense. And I think that that's something that also played into her relationship to her own people, that she found in Jewish existence an existential weakness, both because she felt that her own people were not acknowledging the Messiah who could save them, or who had saved them, and therefore, were almost failing at their own vocation to some extent. But on the other hand, also, of course, the weakness of suffering with the Messiah to some extent in the world. So the Messiah's own suffering being put on them. I don't think that was a tension that Stein ever resolved for herself, this strange in-between guilt and co-suffering with Christ. And I think we just have to let that stand. But I do think that she saw this double weakness, and her response to it, and this is partly to do with her understanding and her practice of empathy. Her response to that was to try to shield, to try to enter into and to suffer alongside her people. So yes, I do think that certainly it brings a particular spiritual coloring to her understanding of what it was to be a Jew who also accepted the Messiah.
Thank you. Somewhat related to that is this question. The person asks, a number of Jewish Christians appear early in Stein's story. Is there any evidence that they had any sort of particular camaraderie, or what do you make of this in her story?
Yeah, that's also an interesting question. I don't know of any letters, which is where this would show up, where she and those around her who, as you say, were also Jewish Christians, ever discuss this, partly because some of those around her who were of Jewish origin but Christians became Christians before she did. And of course, in the case of Adolf Reinach, for example, he died before she converted. But I mean, clearly there is something very there's a particular Jewish flavoring to the intellectual circles of Central Europe in the early 20th century. And there is certainly a camaraderie there of just, Jewish intellectuals who also see themselves as part of the German people, but who also realize that they're somehow on the edges of that. That gives them a particular freedom to explore certain things, both philosophically and, I think, religiously. And so I think this sort of spirit of adventurousness, of outsiderdom, in philosophical circles, in religious circles, and social circles, created a very interesting kind of camaraderie among them.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is for Jason. Jason, thank you for sharing your story, and many are saying the same, so we all appreciate you. And I wanted to ask, in light of you recently having become a father and reflecting on your trajectory, what do you most want to hand on to your daughter in light of your own journey? And what are the greatest sort of gifts that you've discerned along the way that you want to be sure to incorporate into?
That's a great question that I don't know, honestly, how best to answer, and I'm sure I'd give a different answer on different days. I think one of the questions that I deal with is growing up in the Messianic Jewish world inherently raises questions of identity for you. And so I think part of the questions that I deal with is, do I want to pass that along to my daughter? And especially growing up in a Messianic Jewish space and all of my education in Christian institutions, there's this big, major desire in me to just be part of the mainstream Jewish world. So there is that desire to get her involved for her sake in a mainstream Jewish synagogue, perhaps splitting time between a mainstream synagogue and Messianic Jew synagogue or something like that, or a church. Or, but I think one of the main things I want to pass along to her is the beauty of this tradition that's kept the Jewish people alive and a discrete entity throughout the ages, and just the joy that comes with that in even the mundane, the weekly patterns and rhythms of life that are just beautiful. The beauty of the Siddur, for example, of the words that people have prayed for centuries. I think it's that, but at the same time, I don't want that to come at an expense of acknowledging the beauty in the church. But I would say, as because I came to that, I think my love for tradition and liturgy later on, that's something that beauty and that those rhythms, I think, are what I'd like to pass on to her.
Good, thank you for that. You can go ahead and ask the next question.
Sure. So Judith, what would you say? I know we're going to send out a reading list, but what are the best portals into Edith Stein's thought and life, both in terms of what she wrote and things others wrote about her? What are the best entry points if one wants to learn more?
Well, if you're philosophically minded, then Alistair MacIntyre wrote an excellent work called Edith Stein, a Philosophical Prologue, which tries to establish her place in the philosophical canon in the 20th century. It's really very, very good. I think her best biographer is Waltraud Herbstreit, who's published a number of things about her that take very seriously her Jewish identity. Some of the older ones are less good on that. And of course, Antoine Levy is writing on Edith Stein right now, our own Antoine. So I expect that will be a good entry in about a year's or two time.
Wonderful. If I may ask a follow-up, we have a couple people who would like you to expand a bit on Edith's view of vicarious suffering and co-suffering that is so central to her Christology and even a lot of her own actions, as you described. Would you just say more about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, she thought that, and this has to do with her increasing mystical orientation as well. I think I know there was a question also about her mysticism. She came to understand more and more. She came to understand theology more and more as rooted in mystical presence. A sort of presence in God's own presence, and as being really just an account of something that takes place on an existential level. So in a sense, all words, all thinking are just a sort of attempt to think through rationally something that takes place on either an existential or a mystical plane. And so the first responsibility of the Christian is not so much to make sense of the faith, to explain the existence of God. The first responsibility of the Christian is to stand with Christ, and somehow this participation in the suffering of Christ, this living with him somehow, imitatio Christi, in the sense of going through the movement of death and the hope for resurrection with him, she thought had a real effect in the world, and she couldn't explain that effect, but she was deeply convinced that it moved things in the spiritual sphere, you may say. And of course, there are many people who think that this is borne out by her testimony and witness, which may well have been part of what gave birth to the Jewish, Christian, and Messianic Jewish expressions of faith and movements in the later 20th century.
Good, thank you for that. Another question for Jason. Could you comment a little bit on what you consider to be the different emphases between Jewish and Christian forms of prayer?
Well, let me just say I'll discuss my experience in evangelical circles and mainline Protestant circles. So I'm not going to pretend to speak about I have very little experience with Catholic prayer. So let me just put that up front. I think particularly in even the evangelical circles that I've been in, there's this almost the presence of the Spirit is indicated by lack of structure in theory. So there's more of this free style, less emphasis on form. And in the Jewish world, I mean, in Jewish prayer, it's very communal oriented. It's obviously very structured. And so I think those are the big ones that come to mind are form, communal recitation of prayer. And again, this is speaking mostly about the evangelical world. Let me just say, I think very highly of the Book of Common Prayer. I think because it has such resonances with the Siddur, I'm a fan of liturgy in general. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think those are the main differences I see.
Sure, thanks. All right, we have another question about Edith Stein, and this question is, if you could ask her any question today, and she could answer you, what might you ask her about? What might you want to hear from her directly, or where is maybe a gap in what we know about her that you would love to explore?
This is a bad question to ask me, because obviously I would ask her about phenomenology and Thomism. I have some nagging questions about her attempts to reconcile phenomenology and Thomism, and that is certainly what I would talk to her about. But unfortunately, they would not be of great interest to anybody else.
Okay. Jason, do you have any more questions? If not, I think we can move on to the next section of the webinar, which is just wrapping up. Thank you so much, Judith and Jason. This was really phenomenal to hear from both of you. And so now I'd just like to wrap up with the closing announcements and to say, sure, yeah, we can just do this part. So there we go. Yeah, the Yachad BeYeshua website has information about Yachad BeYeshua's history, links to past webinars, a blog, and some additional resources for study. So you can access the site at yachad-beyeshua.org. Check it out, and you can subscribe there to get email updates as well. If you appreciate these events and would like to support this ongoing work, we invite you to make a contribution on the new website as well. Our next public webinar will be on Wednesday, January 12th at this same time slot, and we'll be sending out more details, so that's why it's important to be on the email list. We hope to see you there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Mark Kinzer for some concluding comments and announcements from him.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and special thanks to Judith and for Jason. That was just a terrific session. Normally, we would actually be having one of these webinars in December, but we're going to be doing something different in December, and we will be holding an online mini conference, which will be a set of 3 webinars, 3 90-minute webinars on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, December 14th, 15th, and 16th. So that will be in place of the what would be our December public webinar. And we in our very first public webinar, we focused a bit on Yachad BeYeshua itself. But since that time, that's really not been our focus. We've been trying to to discuss the reality of being Jewish disciples of Yeshua, and we haven't focused so much on ourselves as an organization, as a fellowship. What we want to do in this online mini conference is to focus on the mission of Yachad BeYeshua. And so we will have 3 presentations by our 3 moderators, which includes myself, Judith, so you'll be able to hear more from her, and also from Lee Spitzer. And we'll also hear from several Yachad BeYeshua members and how they're seeking to embody our mission in their own daily lives. The times of the webinars will be the same as usual. The Eastern time zone of North America, it'll be at 11 a.m. So Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, December 14th through 16th. And if you can get that on your schedules, we would love to have you join us for that event. So now I'll just close in prayer. Av HaRachamim, Father of Mercy, remember the faithful service, loving devotion, and sacrificial gift of all your holy ones who surrendered their lives L'Kiddush Hashem, in the sanctification of your name. We remember before you especially our sister Edith Stein, and ask that you would give heed to the prayers she offered along with her blood, and have mercy on Israel, your people, the Christian church, the nations of the world, and all living things. We ask this through our Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, and the strength of the Holy Spirit, to the glory of your eternal name. We look forward to seeing you again in December. God bless you all.
Thank you. See you next time, everyone.
See you next time. Goodbye.